Frostbite burns worse than fire. When Faye dragged a 200-pound dying man through the whiteout conditions of the Bitterroot Mountains, her muscles screamed and her lungs bled. She didn't know the venom ravaging his veins belonged to the most lethal Alpha King on the continent. She just couldn't let him die. The winter of 2024 hit the Colorado high country with a ferocity that local meteorologists called a once-in-a-century anomaly. For Faye Harper, a lone Omega banished to the fringes of the Black Pine Territory, it was just another brutal reality to survive. Faye was not supposed to be alone. Omegas were pack creatures, wired for community, touch, and submission. Solitude usually drove them mad. But Faye had learned that isolation was far safer than the cruelty of a pack that had framed her for treason. Exiled 3 years ago by her former alpha, Caleb, she had carved out a miserable, quiet existence in a dilapidated logging cabin off Highway 93, miles away from any civilized werewolf society. The storm began on a Tuesday, dumping 3 feet of snow in a matter of hours. The temperature plummeted to 20 below zero. Faye was outside, hastily chopping the last of her firewood, when the scent hit her. It wasn't just the metallic tang of blood. It was the sharp, acrid stench of burned ozone, bitter almonds, and melting flesh. Wolfsbane. Specifically, a highly synthesized, weaponized strain laced with silver nitrate. Her inner wolf whimpered, a deeply ingrained instinct urging her to bolt inside, lock the heavy iron deadbolts, and hide under the floorboards. Where there was weaponized wolfsbane, there were hunters. But another scent lingered beneath the poison: petrichor, dark roast coffee, and a deep, agonizing sorrow. It was the scent of a dying wolf. Faye dropped her axe. Shifting into her pale, undersized russet wolf, she bounded through the thigh-high snowdrifts, fighting the blinding whiteout. Half a mile down the ridge, near the frozen banks of an unnamed creek, she found him. He was in human form, a dangerous vulnerability in this weather, suggesting his wolf had entirely given out. He was a mountain of a man, clad in shredded tactical gear that looked expensive and entirely inadequate for a blizzard. His skin was an ashen grey, slick with freezing sweat, and dark, necrotic purple veins spider-webbed up his neck from a massive, ragged puncture wound in his shoulder. Faye shifted back to her human form, shivering violently in her threadbare flannel and jeans. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Hey," she croaked, her voice raspy from disuse. "Hey, you can't sleep here." The man's eyes fluttered open. They were a startling, luminescent amber, the irises of an alpha of immense power. Even dying, the sheer dominance radiating off him made Faye's chest tighten, forcing her chin down in an involuntary display of Omega submission. But the golden light in his eyes was flickering, drowning in a milky haze of poison. "Run!" he choked out, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated against the frozen earth. "They track the blood." "I'm not leaving you," Faye said, her jaw setting with a stubbornness that had cost her everything in her old pack. She quickly assessed the situation. Her cabin was a half-mile back, but it was a dead end. If hunters were tracking him, a wooden shack would be a coffin for them both. The only defensible position with medical supplies was the abandoned U.S. Forest Service watchtower atop Oakhaven Ridge. It was 6 miles away, uphill, through a raging blizzard. For a frail Omega, it was a suicide mission. But Faye dragged her belt from her jeans, pulled the heavy canvas straps from his tactical vest, and began lashing them to a large, broken pine bough she unearthed from the snow. She rolled his massive, unresponsive frame onto the makeshift travois. "You're going to stay awake," Faye ordered, slipping the canvas harness over her own shoulders. The straps bit instantly into her collarbones. She leaned forward, and the agony began. The first 2 miles were a blur of screaming muscles and burning lungs. The snow was a wall of white, erasing the horizon, forcing Faye to navigate entirely by memory and the subtle magnetic pull of the earth that wolves possessed. She dragged him foot by excruciating foot. "Why?" the man murmured deliriously around mile 3. "Omega, too weak. Leave me." "Shut up," Faye grunted, her boots slipping on a patch of black ice concealed by powder. She went down hard, her knees smashing into rock. The jarring stop caused the man to groan in agony as the travois jerked. Faye spat a mouthful of blood into the snow where she had bitten her tongue. She forced herself back up. Her hands, clad in cheap woven gloves, were completely numb. Frostbite was setting in. By mile 5, dusk had fallen, turning the whiteout into a pitch-black, howling void. Faye's vision tunneled. She was hallucinating from exhaustion, seeing the ghosts of her old pack mocking her in the tree line. The man on the sled had gone completely silent, his breathing shallow and rattling. "Don't die," she sobbed, a sound snatched away by the wind. "Please don't die on me. I didn't come this far for a corpse." With a final, guttural scream of effort, her russet wolf forced its way out. Her bones cracked and reformed, her human clothes shredding as she took the harness in her jaws. She dug her paws into the steep incline of Oakhaven Ridge, hauling the man with the desperate, hysterical strength of an animal fighting for survival. When the steel stilts of the watchtower finally materialized out of the gloom, Faye collapsed. She had dragged a 200-pound alpha 6 miles through a frozen hell. She shifted back to her human form, her naked skin instantly burning against the ice, and dragged him up the grated metal stairs by his collar, 1 step at a time, until they tumbled over the threshold into the dark, freezing safety of the tower. The interior of the watchtower was pitch black and freezing, smelling faintly of stale dust, rat droppings, and the lingering scent of pine saw left by Ranger Davis years ago. Faye didn't have time to rest. Her body was entering severe hypothermia, violent shivers racking her small frame, but the alpha was already crossing the threshold of death. Faye stumbled blindly to the emergency cache she knew was hidden beneath the floorboards. Her frozen, clumsy fingers fumbled with the latch, tearing her fingernails, until she pulled out the heavy plastic bin. Inside were the lifelines, thermal blankets, a first aid kit, military-grade chemical heat packs, and a dust-covered bottle of pure grain alcohol. She cracked the heat packs, shoving them under the man's armpits and groin to raise his core temperature. She wrapped them both in the silver mylar blankets. Then she turned her attention to the wound. Faye clicked on a heavy-duty flashlight, gripping it between her teeth. In the harsh beam, the alpha's shoulder was a nightmare. The flesh was necrotizing, the black veins of wolfsbane pumping directly toward his heart. "Forgive me," Faye whispered to his unconscious form. She sterilized a hunting knife with the grain alcohol. With shaking hands, she sliced the wound open wider. Black, viscous blood oozed out, smoking faintly as the chemical silver reacted with the cold air. Using her own limited omega healing saliva and a crude paste of crushed activated charcoal from the emergency water filter, she packed the wound to draw out the toxins. She found an old IV bag of saline in the medical kit, miraculously unfrozen due to the insulated cache, and managed to find a vein in his heavily tattooed forearm. For hours, Faye sat huddled against him, sharing her meager body heat, watching the slow, agonizing rhythm of his chest. She finally had a moment to look at his face. Beneath the grime and blood, his jawline was carved from granite. A jagged silver scar slashed through his left eyebrow, but it was the tattoo on his neck that made Faye's blood run colder than the blizzard outside. an intricate, intertwining triad of wolves circling a crown. The sovereign mark. Faye slapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. This wasn't just a rogue alpha or a mercenary. This was Sullivan Reed, the Alpha King of the Northern Syndicate, the man who controlled half the territories in North America. And someone had managed to strike him down. If the king had been poisoned, it meant his inner circle had been compromised, a betrayal of the highest order. Faye realized with sickening clarity that whoever did this wouldn't stop until they found his body. Around 3 a.m., the wind died down to a low moan. Sullivan's body gave a violent jerk. His eyes snapped open. The milky haze was gone, replaced by a terrifying, predatory clarity. In a fraction of a second, despite being near death moments prior, his alpha reflexes took over. His massive hand shot out, wrapping around Faye's throat, pinning her against the steel wall of the cabin. Faye gasped, dropping the rag she was using to wipe his fevered brow. "Who sent you?" Sullivan snarled, his voice a lethal, raspy whisper. "Was it Gideon? Did my beta send an Omega to finish the job so he wouldn't get his hands dirty?" Faye clawed at his wrist, her feet dangling inches off the floor. No, she choked out. "I saved you." Sullivan's gaze darted around the room, assessing the IV line in his arm, the charcoal packing in his shoulder, the blood on Faye's clothes, and her severe frostbite. His wolf stirred beneath his skin, agitated, pacing. "Mate," his wolf growled in the deep recesses of his mind. Sullivan froze. He stared at the terrified, fragile woman in his grip. She smelled of cheap soap, pine needles, and the distinct, unmistakable sweetness of his destined mate. It was impossible. He was 32, a hardened king who had given up on the myth of the fated mate years ago, and the moon goddess had paired him with a rogue Omega? He released her abruptly. Faye crumpled to the floor, gasping for air, rubbing her bruised neck. "You're an Omega," he stated, his tone a mix of disbelief and ingrained authority. "Unmarked, living in exile. And you're an ungrateful bastard," Faye shot back, coughing violently. The audacity of her words shocked them both. Omegas were subservient by nature. They did not snap at alphas, let alone kings. But Faye had dragged his dead weight 6 miles through ice, and she was fresh out of deference. A dark, dangerous smirk touched the corner of Sullivan's lips. "How far did you carry me?" 6 miles, Faye muttered, pulling herself up onto a stool, keeping a wary distance. From the creek off Highway 93. "You were dying." Sullivan looked at his shoulder, feeling the absence of the blinding agony. The silver was neutralized. The wolfsbane was retreating. He looked at Faye's hands, blistered, cracked, and bruised black and blue. The sheer impossibility of what she had done crashed over him. "You did that alone?" he asked softly. "I didn't have a choice," Faye said, refusing to look him in the eye. "If I left you, your hunters would have found my cabin anyway. I saved you to save myself." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Her Omega instincts to nurture and protect had overridden all logic. Before Sullivan could press her further, a sound shattered the quiet of the night. It wasn't the wind. It was the sharp, distinct snap of a heavy branch breaking under a boot. Sullivan's demeanor shifted instantly. The brief moment of vulnerability vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating king. He reached down to his tactical belt, pulling a heavy, black Sig Sauer pistol that Faye hadn't noticed. "They found the blood trail," Sullivan whispered, his amber eyes locking onto the heavy trap door that led to the stairs. He tried to stand, but his legs buckled. The poison had severely weakened his muscles. His wolf could not shift. He was practically a mortal man right now. Faye felt the familiar spike of panic, the urge to cower. But she looked at the trapdoor, then at the wounded king. This was her territory now. She knew this tower. She moved quickly, silently. She grabbed the heavy bottle of grain alcohol and a rag. "What are you doing?" Sullivan hissed. "Leveling the playing field," Faye whispered back. She unscrewed the cap, stuffed the rag into the neck of the bottle, and grabbed her lighter. She crept toward the trapdoor, listening. Below, heavy footsteps echoed on the grated metal stairs. 2 sets, 3. "He's up there," a gruff voice echoed softly from outside. "I smell his blood. The beta wants his head." Gideon. Sullivan's jaw clenched so hard his teeth audibly ground together. His own beta had orchestrated this coup. Faye stood by the trapdoor. She looked back at Sullivan, her honey-brown eyes blazing with a sudden, fierce defiance that made his heart pound. "Get ready to shoot," she whispered. She lit the rag. As the heavy iron trapdoor groaned and began to push upward from the outside, Faye kicked the latch free, yanked the door open, and dropped the Molotov cocktail straight down the stairwell. The glass of the bottle shattered against the steel grating of the stairwell, followed instantly by a thunderous whoosh as the high-proof grain alcohol ignited. A blinding geyser of orange flame erupted upward, licking the edges of the trapdoor. Below, the quiet night was shredded by the agonized, guttural screams of men burning alive. The heavy stench of roasting flesh and melting synthetic tactical gear instantly overpowered the sharp scent of pine and freezing wind. Sullivan didn't waste a microsecond. As 2 of the attackers tumbled backward off the icy stairs, consumed by the makeshift inferno, a third man, massive and relatively unburned, lunged through the smoke, his hands gripping the edge of the trapdoor. Before the man could pull himself up, Sullivan raised the heavy Sig Sauer. His arm trembled from the lingering wolfsbane, but his amber eyes were dead, calculating, and ruthlessly precise. He squeezed the trigger twice. The deafening cracks echoed in the confined space of the watchtower. Both hollow-point bullets caught the attacker squarely between the eyes. The man slumped backward, vanishing into the smoke and plummeting to the snow-covered earth below. Faye slammed the heavy iron trapdoor shut and threw the rusted deadbolt, her chest heaving. "That won't hold them forever," she gasped, coughing violently as black smoke began to seep through the floorboards. "It doesn't need to," Sullivan rumbled, leaning heavily against the wall, the effort of shooting draining the last of his artificial adrenaline. "But they aren't alone. That was just the vanguard." As if validating the king's words, a voice bellowed from the tree line below, amplified by a heavy megaphone. The sound cut through the howling wind, freezing the blood in Faye's veins. "Burn the tower down. I want Reed's head on a spike, and I want the Omega alive. She has a debt to pay." Faye stumbled backward, her knees hitting the medical cache. She knew that voice. It was a voice that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years. It belonged to the man who had ordered her stripped of her pack markings, who had watched with a sneer as his enforcers dragged her to the territory borders and left her to freeze. "Caleb," she whispered, the name tasting like ash on her tongue. Sullivan's sharp hearing caught the terrified whisper. Despite the agonizing pain in his shoulder, his alpha instincts surged, roaring in defense of his mate. "Your former alpha," he demanded, his voice dangerously low. He exiled me," Faye stammered, panic threatening to drown her. "He framed me for stealing pack funds. But why is he here? He's a minor alpha. He doesn't have the power to hunt a king." "He does if Gideon gave him the resources," Sullivan deduced, his mind working rapidly despite the poison. "My traitor Beta needed a local pack to track me through this terrain without alerting my loyalists at the border. Gideon bought Caleb's loyalty with my throne." A heavy thud shook the watchtower. Then another. The attackers were firing incendiary rounds into the dry, rotting wooden stilts, and the underside of the cabin. Within seconds, the ancient, dried-out pine boards of the floor began to blister and catch fire. The smoke inside the small room grew thick and suffocating. "We have to jump," Sullivan commanded. He pushed himself off the wall, staggering toward the large, reinforced glass window facing the steepest drop of the ridge. "Are you insane?" Faye cried, coughing as the smoke burned her lungs. "It's a 40-foot drop. The snow might cushion us, but you're half dead. The impact will shatter your spine." "Staying here guarantees we burn," Sullivan countered, his eyes flashing with a sudden, golden intensity. The mate bond, recognizing the immediate threat to Faye's life, was forcing his wolf to surface, suppressing the wolfsbane just enough to give him a final burst of supernatural strength. He didn't wait for her to argue. Sullivan grabbed a heavy metal chair and hurled it through the glass window. The freezing blizzard whipped into the room, instantly feeding the flames behind them. He turned to Faye, stepping into her space. He wrapped his massive, uninjured arm tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Even through the layers of their ruined clothes, the spark of the mate bond sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. "Bury your face in my neck," he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "I'll take the impact. Trust me." Faye looked into his luminescent amber eyes. For the first time in her life, she saw an alpha who wasn't looking down at her, but at her. She wrapped her arms tightly around his broad shoulders and buried her face against the sovereign tattoo on his neck. The floor beneath them gave way with a sickening groan. Sullivan kicked off the window ledge, launching them into the black, howling void of the blizzard. The wind roared in Faye's ears, a terrifying sensation of weightlessness gripping her stomach. It felt like an eternity, plummeting through the icy dark. Then, the brutal impact. Sullivan twisted them mid-air, taking the brunt of the fall on his back. They crashed through the thick canopy of a massive blue spruce, branches snapping and tearing at their clothes, before slamming violently into a 10-foot snowdrift piled at the base of the ridge. The snow swallowed them whole, plunging them into freezing, suffocating darkness. Faye scrambled desperately, digging her way upward until her hand broke the surface. She dragged herself out of the crater, gasping for the freezing air. She turned back, frantically digging into the snow. "Sullivan!" she screamed, abandoning all protocol, using the king's given name. She found his hand and pulled with all her might. He emerged from the snow, unconscious, a dark line of blood trailing from his temple. But his chest was rising and falling. He had shielded her perfectly. She didn't have a single broken bone. High above them, the watchtower collapsed in a spectacular eruption of sparks and flames, a beacon of destruction against the winter sky. The hunters would be coming down the ridge to find their bodies. Faye grabbed the collar of his tactical vest. She was exhausted, battered, and freezing. But she was a wolf, and she was far from finished. Shifting into her russet form, she bit down on the heavy canvas straps once more, dragging the king into the deep cover of the ancient pines, letting the blizzard erase their tracks. The rhythmic, deafening thwump, thwump, thwump of heavy rotor blades tore Faye from a feverish, exhausted sleep. She was huddled in a shallow cave beneath the roots of a fallen oak, her small wolf body curled tightly around Sullivan to keep his core temperature up. The storm had broken, giving way to a blindingly bright, frigid dawn. Through the trees, she saw them. 3 sleek, black tactical helicopters hovered over the smouldering ruins of the watchtower. On the side of the fuselages was the unmistakable silver emblem of the Northern Syndicate. Ropes dropped, and dozens of heavily armed wolves rappelled down, moving with terrifying military precision. Leading them was a towering man with pitch-black hair and eyes like chips of ice. Lawson, the king's gamma and chief enforcer. Faye let out a weak, warbling howl. It was pathetic, but it was enough. Lawson's head snapped toward her location. Within minutes, they were surrounded by loyalists. When Lawson saw the state of his king and the tiny, frost-bitten Omega guarding him with bared teeth, he immediately dropped to one knee, bowing his head in profound respect to Faye. "We have you," Lawson said softly. "You're safe." 72 hours later, the world was a different place. Faye woke up to the smell of lavender and antiseptic. She opened her eyes to a ceiling of vaulted, hand-carved mahogany. She was lying in a bed the size of a small island, wrapped in silk sheets. Her hands were heavily bandaged, coated in a soothing, high-grade healing salve that smelled of eucalyptus. The biting cold of her rusty cabin felt like a lifetime ago. This was the Blackwood estate, the impenetrable fortress of the Northern Syndicate in the heart of Wyoming. The heavy oak door clicked open, and Sullivan walked in. The transformation stole Faye's breath. He was no longer the dying man she had dragged through the snow. He was a force of nature. Dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal suit that emphasized his massive shoulders, he moved with the predatory grace of a ruling alpha. The jagged scar on his brow only added to his dangerous allure. He radiated a terrifying, magnetic power, but as his amber eyes locked onto her, the intensity softened into something that made Faye's heart race. He walked to the edge of the bed and sat down, carefully taking one of her bandaged hands in his. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice a deep, soothing rumble. "Warm," Faye whispered, her voice still raspy. For the first time in years. She looked around the opulent room. What happened? Lawson's medical team synthesized an antidote from the wolfsbane residue on my gear. "I healed rapidly," Sullivan explained, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. "As for the rest, Gideon is currently occupying a heavily reinforced, lightless cell in the sublevels of this estate. He will face a tribunal for high treason." "And Caleb?" Faye asked, her heart pounding against her ribs. Sullivan's eyes darkened, a flash of lethal intent crossing his features. "Caleb's pack was surrounded by my enforcers before noon on the day of our rescue. When my men presented evidence of his collusion with Gideon, his own pack turned on him. Caleb has been stripped of his alpha status and is currently awaiting my judgment." He leaned closer, his gaze burning into hers. "And I intend to let you deliver the sentence." Faye stared at him, stunned. "Me? But I'm an Omega, a rogue." "You are no rogue," Sullivan said fiercely, his hand moving to cup her cheek. The spark of the mate bond flared brilliantly, a warm, golden heat that settled deep in Faye's chest, chasing away the last lingering shadows of her exile. "You are my mate. The moon goddess chose you for me, and after what you did, I would challenge the goddess herself if she tried to take you away." Faye swallowed hard, tears pricking her eyes. "Sullivan, I'm broken. I'm weak. An Alpha King needs a strong Luna from a noble bloodline, not someone who lived in a shack and ate canned beans to survive." "Weak?" Sullivan scoffed, a genuine, reverent smile touching his lips. "Faye, you dragged a 200-pound, dying Alpha 6 miles uphill through a once-in-a-century blizzard. You fought off 3 trained assassins, blew up a watchtower, and saved my life. You possess a strength of will that puts my entire military vanguard to shame." He leaned his forehead against hers, his breath ghosting over her lips. "I don't want a Luna who knows how to host gala dinners and smile for the Syndicate," he murmured. "I want the wolf who refused to let me die in the ice. I want you." Faye's inner wolf, long suppressed and cowering, surged forward, recognizing her true alpha, her true home. The fear that had dictated her life evaporated, replaced by a fierce, protective love for the man sitting before her. "Okay," she whispered, her hands reaching up to grip the lapels of his suit. "I'm yours." Sullivan's eyes flashed gold. He didn't hesitate. He leaned down, his lips brushing the sensitive crook of her neck. He inhaled her scent deeply before his canines extended, sinking into the soft flesh right over her pulse point. The claiming bite wasn't painful. It was a rush of pure, unadulterated euphoria. The mate bond snapped fully into place, a psychic link that flooded Faye's mind with Sullivan's unwavering devotion, his profound respect, and his terrifying power. In return, he felt her immense courage, her resilience, and the fierce fire that burned beneath her fragile exterior. When he pulled away, he licked the twin puncture wounds, sealing them. The mark of the king, the triad of wolves and the crown, began to slowly manifest on her skin, mirroring his own. Faye Harper was an exile no more. She was the Luna of the Northern Syndicate, and the entire werewolf world was about to find out exactly what happens when you cross the king's mate. Faye's transformation from an exiled Omega into the powerful Luna of the Northern Syndicate was a brutal reckoning. Sullivan Reed didn't just give her a crown, he gave her the strength to burn her past. Together, the king who survived the poison and the wolf who braved the blizzard ruled with an iron grip, their unbreakable bond forged eternally in ice and fire, leaving their enemies in ashes.